Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to our viewers to another podcast of the Doctor's Lab with myself, Dr. Abdul Haqq Baker, and Dr. Khalid Green. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Khalid.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hayyakum Allah.
Good to see you. How are you today?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing good. Have my coffee and I'm ready to go. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve you.
Ameen, and you, my brother, mashallah. And a quick thing, Dr. Khalid, I want to mention something here because some may be thinking, why does Abdul Haqq refer to and introduce ourselves as doctors at the beginning? Not only because it's the doctor's lab, but one of the experiences I've had, I think, in the wider environment amongst Muslims, non-black Muslims, I hasten to add, is the reference or acknowledgement of academia that's been undertaken by black Muslim cohorts is seldom acknowledged in particular circles, and I find that concerning and disconcerting to an extent. So as this is our show, I think it's only right to acknowledge the academic qualifications in this instance. So I thought I'd just start with that in case there are those who think, why do they keep doing it? It's not in boast or vain or anything like that. It's just to acknowledge that in this field, hence us coming together to do the Doctor's Lab, that we have studied what we are expounding upon fortnightly, inshallah. And I hope you agree with me on that observation.
No. It's important to acknowledge achievements bi'idhnillah ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless with tawfiq. Ameen.
Ameen. Jazakallah khair. And this week, this particular week, we're following on from last week to catch up because we'd missed a week, and Jazakallah khair, we agreed to do a week back to back on this. And today we're going to continue the strain of which we highlighted towards the end of last week's show. That's none other than looking at, as you refer to it, as the progressive extremism. And as I mentioned last week as well, I termed it in the mid-noughties, and especially in my PhD studies, as liberal extremism. So I think it's important that we focus on liberal and progressive extremism today, which is at the opposite end of the spectrum, if you like, or the continuum, where we've focused for a long time and will continue to in other shows on violent extremism, religious extremism, Khariji tendencies, takfirism. Now, we've expounded upon that, I think, enough in the previous shows, and we're going to continue because our PhDs are looking at that. Seldom do we see a focus within academia, especially wider non-Muslim academia, on liberal extremism or progressive extremism. And we're hearing discussions within Muslim communities now about progressive extremism, as we're seeing. And we mentioned one of the groups that's in the spotlight at the moment from the US in that instance. But there hasn't been an academic lens through which it's been looked, or spotlight which has been shone upon it. And the fact that we've studied that going years back now, I think it's pertinent that we start that discussion and continue that discussion today so others can see that. I remember when I mentioned this liberal extremism and presented my emerging research and theoretical frameworks in I think it was around 2005. I was at a conference, an international conference, and we broke out into different work groups. And I was shocked at the anger of a non-Muslim practitioner and academic. I don't recall who it was when I brought that term. It was something that shook his core, that I was questioning liberal society, which I accused of decadence, moral decay. And I said, if you've got religious extremism on one side, by default, you've got this on the other side. And he refused to accept, and a few others, that it existed, despite the evidence that was there and that I'd presented. And we all see it around us now, mashallah. So what did you look at in your studies on this, as you've called it, progressive extremism? And let's be clear, progressive extremism, liberal extremism, I think, are one and the same. And within the context of which we're going to be speaking, I suspect you're going to talk about progressive extremism within the religious context, in the Muslim context, whereas mine traverses the societal context, but also we'll be speaking specifically about some Muslim context as well from a UK perspective.
Yeah, so my research, as you mentioned, also dealt with that concept of, I guess, liberal extremism or progressive extremism. And I can't recall with regards to my master's if that was something I talked about at the end. But what I found during the course of my research during the PhD is that due to the extremism of ISIS, which we could probably classify as being Khawarij-like, to say the least, that there has been a pushback, and there was a pushback during this time because so many people were running away and trying to distance themselves from the ISIS extremism and this Khawarij extremism that we could say they rushed to, if you want to say, the Murjia camp, and worse than that, this progressive extremism. And I refer to it as progressive extremism because I'm talking about, as you mentioned, the boundaries of the the Sharia boundaries that, I can recall, and this is also from the book La'iq, I think, the one you quoted from him during the last podcast, his work on extremism. I use that extensively. Excuse me. I use that extensively as well, the Arabic text. And I recall that Sheikh bin Fawzan, he referred to extremism in general, ghulu, as being tajawuz al-had, meaning to go beyond the bounds. So I was looking at, and I was saying, these people go beyond the bounds, the Takfiris go beyond the bounds, but the progressive liberal extremists go beyond the bounds totally of Islam. Like, they destroy the fundamentals of Islam, whereas the Khawarij recognize, okay, yeah, we need to pray, we still hold Islamic tenets. But these people say, hey, let's just redefine everything. Everything's up for grabs. Let's base it on philosophy, base it upon our desires. Shirk, why are we defining shirk like that? Hey, let's it's all good. Religious, what do we call that? Wahdat al-adyan, the one central religious, what do we call that in English? Wahdat al-adyan, the
that plurality of religion.
Plurality of religion. Exactly. So this is their push. Their push has so much, especially to the extremism, you find so many elements of disbelief in it. Just totally dismantling, destroying so many concepts. And we'll bring some actual quotes to affirm that as well.
What you've said, which I like, which is very key, and I hadn't thought about it, it's there in front of us all the time, is the Khawarijite belief, destructive, distorted, astray, accepted. We all accept that. And there's that recognition of that universally, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. But what you've said in describing how the progressive or liberal extremism dismantles virtually everything to the point that the religion is unrecognizable. And I want to put up the first framework that I developed in my PhD. If Hassan can put that up, and it shows, for example, and I wrote at the top there, that was a quote: liberalism, if left unconstrained, can also contribute towards a pendulum swing to the other fanatical extreme, particularly when it replaces previous traditional moral norms to become the benchmark of Western values. So liberalism there, you'll see on the left of the screen, failure to adequate address, this is their behavior, failure to address Muslim concerns adequately, lack of knowledge-based decisions, references more towards intellect than Islamic edicts and rulings, more concern with public perception and position with higher authorities, etc., self-appointed and often non-representative of Muslim communities. Therefore, the conclusion I came to then was passivism or inaction. Then before going to the moderate perspective, going over to the fanatical extreme, which we've been speaking about for a few weeks now, and our studies have been more focused on the fanatical religious extreme, where we see the Kharijis and, as you mentioned, ISIS fit into that description. Imbuing emotional responses from the followers, propelling them to respond physically, urgency, reaction of response, uncontrollable hatred towards one's own society and those who do not subscribe to their view, misinterpretation, distortion of religious texts to justify extreme beliefs, and terrorism. And then the moderate perspective there, this is where I hold, and I know you do, and we all do as Salafis, hold Salafiyah. Now, unfortunately, there may be little divergences within the behavioral context, but not theologically. But Salafis, I held, when you look at these two extremes of liberalism and the liberal extreme and the fanatical religious extreme, Salafiyah with its methodology, the methodological approach, the ideology is the one, and societally is the one that's in the moderate perspective. And if you take that down, Hassan, please, if that's okay. And before we move on that, and I'll ask you if you how that sits with you, what I've just highlighted. Now that's given a theoretical framework and context. Wa alaikum salam, rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good to see you with us, Sister Salwa, mashallah, tabarakallah. So my thing now, Khalid, is yes, some will say, okay, that's your theoretical perspective that I developed around before I'd started my PhD, when I was doing presentations, so 2003, 2004. But I now want to map that and show, this was the framework I'm going to highlight now. I developed at a conference that I went to in Jordan. It was a NATO conference, actually, very interesting. And this was around 2004, I believe it was. But there was a non-Muslim academic practitioner who put a framework, and I built upon that. And what he'd done was very interesting in his own perception, placing particular entities according to a spectrum, which is more detailed than what I've given, but it posits these positions, and I'll explain that. So if the second slide can be put up, please, Hassan, and I will explain that. So if we're looking, for example, I don't want the viewers to become confused by this. You'll see on the left again, the liberal extreme, okay? And you'll see the arrows going up to the top, pointing to the liberal extreme, and you'll see the opposite going down. And this is with regards to constructive or destructive societal contributions and input. Then you'll see on the right-hand side, the political extreme, fanatical, religious extreme. Okay, and you'll see, if you look carefully along these, you'll see at the political extreme, right at the end on that middle line that goes across, you'll see Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and they sit there accurately. You move a little bit in and you see them at the bottom. You'll see that it's right at the bottom, because the red at the bottom is negative and polarizing societal contributions. Anything above that middle line, that horizontal line, is seen with the green you can see at the top as the more positive and constructive societal contribution and input. So as we're looking now at the liberal extreme, progressive extreme, let's look carefully at the left, the far left. Look below that horizontal line where the negative and polarizing societal contributions or input are. You'll see Salman Rushdie, Majid Nawaz, Quilliam Foundation. That's who was posited at that side of the spectrum. The only ones that you'll see that were put by this academic above the spectrum, I added some names there, like, for example, Majid Nawaz and ISIS, because remember this framework from the mid noughties. But when you look at the middle and those that are above the horizontal line, so they're on the positive and constructive side of societal contribution. And in the middle, he placed Salafis. He placed Muslim Association of Britain, which is more of an Ikhwani entity. Okay. And he put some other community leaders and academics, which I didn't name theologians in that particular instance. But it's interesting that a non-Muslim academic who came from a practitioner field, the police, in fact, he was with the Metropolitan Police, he found in his research that Salafis were also within the moderate perspective. And this reinforced that previous framework that I gave. So I'll leave it there for a few more seconds for you to see. Everything above that horizontal line, you can see the green writing at the top, positive contributions to society. Anyone below that horizontal line, and depending on what side of the spectrum, liberal extreme or political extreme, they were negative, polarizing, and destructive societal contributions. So we see that the liberal extremes, the progressives like Quilliam, Majid Nawaz, are not actually societal positive influences in that instance. And can you remove the slide now, Hassan? We'll get back in. I'll pass it over to you. I don't know if your research or your views on what I've highlighted from my own research tally up in any way.
What is very interesting, and I was thinking this just as soon as you put up that chart, I was thinking about, because those are aspects of your research I didn't see for whatever, because I was looking for a specific thing. I didn't obviously read from the very beginning of your PhD to the very end. You know, I went and I was looking for certain information and benefiting from your research. And what is so interesting is how much in conformity we are. And even some of those very conclusions, especially as far as the liberal, I didn't even know you talked about the liberalism like that, or the progressive Muslims, and our conclusions are basically exactly the same, you know? So this is what I would have to say as far as your chart. That was a very interesting chart, as you said, from a non-Muslim academic, and you maybe tweaked it a bit. And yeah, I thought it was, you know, we might have some different definitions as probably as far as what we would define as moderate and so forth, because we're looking at it from a, you know, a pure Islamic perspective, but and purity meaning orthodoxy and what we believe to be orthodoxy, which is Salafiyah. And so yeah, I found that very interesting, that we actually concur really to the letter in that, because I did not, I'm telling you right now, I did not see that aspect of your research about liberalism and progressives, and we both referred to it as extremism. We both saw the danger there. And I think, you know, like I said, that what I was finding in my research, and now we see the reality of it, is there's been such a pushback against that and everyone distancing. So now they are making great grounds. I think in the past few years, since the fall of ISIS and what have you, that this liberal progressive perspective is making much greater grounds all over the world, in Muslim and non-Muslim countries, that they've raised their head, they're getting the funding, they're getting the acceptance, and it's becoming mainstream. And I'll end this little point right here. I was just found out about a Somali woman, for example, in somewhere in Europe, who has all these adaptations to her body physically, who's calling the youth as an example, saying, hey, before marriage, you need to experience things. This is my view. This is this. So what we're seeing is this is just the fact that she can do this outwardly and keep and propagate this nonsense and garbage, and sometimes open kufr and disbelief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his religion. And that becomes accepted. And there's a huge youth following. There's a lot of Somali girls that are following this. They're following this stuff and getting fed total garbage and this liberal extremism. And I really see the reason it's raising its head and its head is being propped up is because now it's become a huge reaction and a backlash. Muslims are really scared of that extremism of ISIS and those guys, but they've ran to another extreme, you know, and that's an acceptable extreme to non-Muslims, as we saw Macron, the French president, recently talking about those French values. Hey, we need to deal with radical Islam. Islam is going through all these problems. He just said this, you know, this open statement, but he's not dealing with those issues of what is causing radicalism in his country. And it's clear that what his detest and his how he detests Islam and Islamic anything pretty much. So yeah,
what you've said is absolutely right, and I think that touching upon Macron and his statement, I think that obviously there's a deflection by him in making such a statement that Islam has problems, because let's pause for a moment and look at the world. The world is in a quagmire of mess at the moment when we look at what's happening in the US, in your country, where you're from, when we're looking in the UK, when we're looking in the European countries, and we're seeing fragmentations and huge problems and dissonance with democracy across various lands, and kickback to that, because of the system being defective in itself. So while he's speaking and deflecting focus on Islam, they've got to look in their own backyards of what's actually taking place. But I think on mentioning examples of that, further examples of that liberalism, I want to share what that actually looks like. And I'm going to refer to an article that I wrote following listening to Majid Nawaz one Easter weekend, and him basically affirming what the Pope had said concerning an article of our faith and the Christian faith, if you like, about none other than the afterlife and the hellfire. So I want to read this, because one of the things we're doing, which we want the viewers to look at, is that not only are we bringing our theoretical perspectives, remember those theoretical perspectives were tested upon practical examples, and often in unique ways. And so bringing these examples to show that what we are saying is not abstract, it is a reality. And as you said, it's really taken on momentum in 2020, because those frameworks that I put together were from 2005 in my PhD research. And I'd started developing the first one before that, as you said. So we're talking 16, 17 years later. And look at the reality ISIS come through. And as you said in the beginning of the show, that move from some feel they have to flee from religious orthodoxy to progressiveness, adopting mergia beliefs, and some of them even leaving Islam. The apostasy rates we're seeing in some Muslim lands, and the apostasy rates have increased exponentially from individuals fleeing this what they think is religious orthodoxy, when in itself is actually extremism. So they're fleeing, as I've mentioned, that first framework, and both frameworks, you see a pendulum swing from religious extremism and the understanding, and the society saying that that's religious orthodoxy, that's what Islam looks like, Macron's comments, for example, and individuals become scared and browbeaten and afraid of that, and moving right across to the spectrum or the pendulum, right across to liberal extremism. And I refer to none other at the moment than Majid Nawaz. I wrote an article following an interview. He's a LBC mainstream radio host on the 2nd of April 2018. And what he did is that he referred to, as I mentioned, the Pope had mentioned allegedly said something that, and claimed bad souls are not punished, and that hell does not exist. This was from the Pope.
Wow.
Okay. Wow. Now, what Majid then said, okay, is he asked this: how can anyone in this day and age, any person of intelligence, believe in a literal burning hellfire? And so I hope the Pope did say this. And then imagine the one continued. And now he's done this great thing of denying a literal burning fire of hell that goes on forever and ever. I think that's a good step in the right direction. But some conservative Catholics are outraged. They're accusing him of heresy and saying that he should be removed. Now, Nawaz then quoted from the Bible and then questioned, what kind of eternally merciful God creates an eternal burning pit of sulfur in which your skin is roasted alive? This hellfire business cannot be literal. So I, for one, welcome the Pope's move. Now, I'm going to continue here. Then he quoted a verse from the Quran. And this is what he exclaimed. Now, remember, Dr. Khalid, I listened to this. I recorded it, back and recorded it. So after quoting verses related from the Quran, he exclaimed, while stifling his laughter, quote, you cannot, in all reasonableness, in this day and age, believe such stories. And so thank you, Pope Francis. It's high time Muslims did the same thing and moved from a literal definition of burning fire to a more humane, humanistic, and metaphorical chastisement.
Yeah, that's high powered. Yeah.
That's what he said. You can still find it if you search LBC on that date, beginning of April. This is what he said. This is an individual who used to once be with Al-Muhajirun, Hizb ut-Tahrir, was extreme, ideologically extreme. He was imprisoned in Egypt. He had his epiphany, he said, while imprisoned, and Amnesty International or one of these advocacy groups a petition to have him released. He came back to the UK. He shunned and eschewed those extreme views, and then he swung right across to the other end of the pendulum and firmly stuck there with these liberally extreme views where he is right now, where he's questioning, he's doubting, he's mocking a pillar of faith, not only for the Muslims, but the Christian Catholic belief that he endorsed. And we're not saying that that's correct, but we know the Asiatic faiths, the Abrahamic faiths, they have some similarities with regards to belief in the hereafter. So he's basically just denied a pillar of Islam or an article of Islam in its entirety. And as I said, if you need to hear him giggling, trying to stifle his laughter after reading verses of the Quran. Now, if this is not liberal extremism from the progressives at its worst, then I don't know what is.
Yeah. You find this as a trend. That's what you're saying exactly is, subhanAllah, it's echoed in the writings of all these progressives. And some of them are Muslim academics. SubhanAllah, so much kufr that, that is kufr sarih. That is just outside the fold of Islam. You have nothing left of Islam. And la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. This is a what can we say? And I think, as you alluded to prior, in your chart, in the first chart that you put up about the those early sects like the Mu'tazila, and the Ahl Kalam, or the rationalist and so forth, that these people, and they literally praise them too. I have quotes directly I used in my research that they're praising the Mu'tazila. They say, oh, those great, and how free thinking they were. And, it is amazing. It is amazing. That's what I mean by they just destroy all the boundaries of Islam and actually make istihza, or ridiculing, the religion of Islam. And someone put up a thing and said, I wonder what the Egyptian authorities did to cause him to do that. Egyptian authorities, regardless of what there it is again, the Egyptian authorities are not responsible for his total disbelief and dismantling the Islamic theology and going to his opinions and whims. Yes, that can be a source to cause you to go, but then that means you're going to go back. Now you're free, and you're going to propagate disbelief and ridiculing the religion of Islam, ridiculing those things which the scholars refer to as an Arabic term, ma'lum min ad-din bi-darura, that are known by the religion, or are known to the religion by necessity. Okay, those are things every Muslim knows: is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists, that there is a hell, and there's Jannah, and these are things that the children don't have to think about. It's clear, it's known, and then you go and you ridicule it. That is like, and that's Go ahead.
That's absolutely. And assalamu alaikum to our sister Shabnan who posed that question. He actually explained, sister, that he had this epiphany because he was imprisoned with two other extremists who were they were from the Muslim Brotherhood, and discussions with them made him start reflecting upon the extremist ideology that he actually had. So from what I recall from his narrative, he said he was tortured, but not extensively. But it wasn't that made him reflect. That, in fact, pushed him further into his extremist beliefs. It was the conversations and the discourse with these two individuals that made him start reflecting. And then seeing that Amnesty International, who were Christian-based, was showing so much compassion because he was British by virtue of his identity. They didn't care that he was extreme. They didn't care that he was Muslim. So that made him look at the British society and reflect on his antipathy towards them. And this was his pivotal moment of change. But this is the point now. Moving away from extremism of any kind is something that we all encourage. But this pendulum swing that has taken place with him and many others who have said they've come former, they call themselves formers in the UK now, former extremists, former radicals. And you've got individuals who were never extreme, who are claiming that mantle because it is viewed upon favorably by government. And government, for example, will now start paying attention to you and start saying, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to fund you. We want you to come in and speak to extremists because it resonates with you. And the issue is this. What they've missed out is that middle spectrum that I've highlighted in both of those frameworks. Those, like the Salafis, who've never been extreme, have always been in the middle, fighting extremism on either side of the spectrum, but now they want to go from this pendulum swing characteristic of individuals who still haven't finished their journeys, even though they may have moved towards the liberal extremism away from the religious extremism they once espoused. And I speak to that towards the conclusion of my PhD, in which I mentioned the following here. Continuing governmental support for such groups and or personalities has already served to alienate Muslim communities even further. Such support risks, in my estimation, I said in the researchers' estimation, exacerbating the pendulum swing effect among Muslim youth from a more mainstream understanding of Islam towards a politicized and violent extremist interpretation. Additionally, an unwitting or indeed deliberate bias to support such narrative may lead to increased conflation of socially conservative but mainstream revivalist groups within extremism. And I can conclude on this part that I mentioned about such entities, such liberal extremes, and the government favoring them instead of realizing that this is just yet another extremism. I said here, this would compound the status quo and detract from existing evidence that continues to identify these very groups as the most effective antidote to tackling violent extremism at the heart of where it currently proliferates, the grassroots. So this is what I'm saying. You will compound the problem with those most effective at combating extremism, being the Salafis, and basically marginalizing them even further. And that's something that we've seen today, Khalid, for this preference towards these liberally extreme, progressively extreme entities, in which the end result that we see is confusion of religion, and in some instances, abandonment of religion altogether.
Yeah, in short, what you said, that it is not effective, for one. They don't know the narrative as well as Salafis do, as far as dealing with the takfiri, extremist, jihadis, if you will. And secondly, it's just unacceptable as an Orthodox Muslim to accept those people on any terms, because for the West, they're actually, they will never see it as progressive extremism, because that's what they want. They want you to destroy Islam and discard the Sharia and discard everything Islamic. They don't want you to wear hijab. They want you to take off your hijab and just wear it whatever. And you know, for women to have multiple husbands, that's okay with them. That's what they want. They want this kind of stuff. So for them, those people have the appropriate ideology. They just don't have the strength and the effectiveness. We, on the other hand, find it totally that they're not effective, and they're totally unacceptable. It's unacceptable that we would go from a wicked innovation, you know, with those extremists, to disbelief, you know. And this is so interesting because, and I actually brought this up in my research too, how the Salaf used to also talk about these issues, meaning the pious predecessors, those first three generations. There's narrations that mention about the one who's always changing. He's so quick, he's so fickle, that this person you'll see until they eventually leave the religion. And how many of people have we seen? They started out as Sufi, then they became a takfiri, then they went to the other extreme, then maybe they left Islam. I can think of countless people I know like this. The example we mentioned prior, Morton Storm, is a good example. Yes. He was a new convert. He came to Yemen. I met him there in Damaj. He was never a serious student of knowledge, regardless of what he says in his book. Okay, he was there for a short period of time. He left Damaj. He instantly got more or less with a lot of very high level Ikhwan Muslimin. Then it progressed. So he was just moving from methodology to methodology without being grounded. And this is exactly what the Salaf said, until he had that same epiphany that you mentioned years later. And he mentions this in his book. He says that he was so upset that he couldn't go to Somalia to fight with, I think it was Ittihad at that time. I can't remember if it was Shabab or Shabab during his time. And he said he wanted to go there, but they were being bombed so much, it was just hard for him to get out of the country. And he remembers talking to a non-Muslim who was like a security guard saying, is this what your religion calls you to? And that's what shook him up. So it wasn't the intelligence services beating him up and this and that and the other, but it was just finally he was not grounded. And that's why we always ask Allah for ikhlas with the bat, meaning sincerity to Allah and firmness on the sunnah, because you'll see those people, they're always changing from extreme to extreme until they leave the religion. I had another example in Saudi. I can think of a couple of people that left Islam in Saudi Arabia. One of my colleagues from the UK, I was shocked. And it was interesting because his background, his nationality is, I'm saying this because the people who asked about him, they were Pakistani and Bengali, computer workers and also cleaners. And they asked me, they said, is that guy Muslim? I said, yeah, he's from, inshallah ta'ala, because I knew he'd already pretty much abandoned Islam. They say, well, why is he always eating with the non-Muslims and it's Ramadan? We always see him every day. He's going to eat with those guys and he doesn't fast. I say, yeah, this is where it's been going for a long time. And so that's the point is they're always going from one extreme to another. And I talked to him during a lot of his transition as work colleagues. And he said, yeah, I visited the masjid in in Brixton. He said, oh, it was, I went there back in the day and it was just too extreme. They were, because he didn't like, talking about disbelief and this and that and the other. And, sure enough. And then he told me he loved Yasser Qadhi for a while. And then he loved something else. And then, subhanAllah, look, now he's, getting piano lessons for his children and, and praising that as something great, and his house on riba, and all this.
And what you
see it, man.
Reactionaries, Assalamu alaikum, reaction, Jazakallah khair. As he said, people tend to go from one extreme to the other. He cannot recall something going from balanced Islam to extreme Islam. Can you? And that's a very good question, because we don't. When, as you've mentioned something about being grounded, and yes, as reactionaries highlighted there about basically being grounded and not moving from that, some being very harsh, and then later on becoming extremely lax, and that is a reality. But some may challenge us and say, well, okay, we know people who had Salafi burnout. You had that Omar Lee speaking about that years ago. To look at it now, that needs to have a context on it. I never really questioned or that didn't challenge or comment. I just watched what was going on in that instance. There could be emotional, mental, psychological issues that affect an individual in whatever delineation of religion that he's following, whether it's in Islam, whether it's outside of Islam and another faith altogether. So that can be one of the factors that are actually there. There can also be, that you've highlighted, the individual was not grounded. So let's be very clear here. We're talking about liberal and progressive extremism, but this includes as well those on the fanatical Khariji extreme as well. And I challenge anyone, and I know you'll be with me on this, Khalid. If anyone wants to say, no, Daesh, ISIS, they're Salafi, just because they make the claim, there's no way that in actuality, if the foundations of Salafism, the foundations, the methodology, the manhaj, are clear. And I'm not talking about the hybridization that we've been talking about the few weeks before. I'm talking about the madhab salaf, okay, the madhab salaf. When we're talking about that, we're talking about the ijma that is there from the madhab of the salaf. Then if you're grounded in those principles, those usul, okay, and different fiqh issues come where there's disagreement of the scholars and you're not confusing them and conflating them with aqidah, you get your grounding in Salafiyah in that particular instance. And what I want to do also is I want to talk about the stage of development that we are at, the cognitive development many of us are at when we are to become grounded. And if the third slide can be put up, please, Hassan, to discuss this. This was another framework that I developed, and it was about the life cycle of converts or young Muslims after they'd converted. But it also refers to second, third generation Muslims as well. And you'll see that founding phase, which is when the person reverts to Islam, converts to Islam, and they're very idealistic and their understanding is very abstract. They're watching YouTube videos and lectures, they're listening to podcasts, and they haven't got a context of what is taking place. So they have this sense of idealism. Now, if on the one hand, it's a politicized understanding they're being taught, they are vulnerable, they are susceptible to violent radicalization. If it's a very liberal understanding that's being expounded to them, that you don't have to wear hijab and you can still do what you were doing in your former life and everything because Islam's wide and everything like that, the abstract understanding is going to prevail, and that's going to possibly determine the pathway, the trajectory as they develop as Muslims. When they move to that second phase now, that's another vulnerable stage, because their sense of idealism moves into overzealousness in whatever they're upon. You've mentioned that Somali sister and what she's doing to her body and saying about liberalism and everything like that. She's now active in propagating that liberalism, that liberal extreme that she's upon. Just like the young Muslim who has been politicized, and he's been emotionally imbued with that sense of injustice that we need to fight for the Ummah. There are no soldiers for the Ummah, and the atrocities that are being done across the Muslim world. And so that idealism, that abstract understanding, propels that individual towards a degree of extremism. These two phases that I've mentioned to you are very, very vulnerable phases for the individuals, whether they're going to go into religious extremism or they're going to go into liberal extremism. However, if they are grounded properly at the founding phase, upon Tawheed, learning about Tawheed in all its rudimentary and its detailed aspects, as well as knowing how to contextualize it. And they're learning about the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, the Sunnah. They're learning these rudimentary aspects, and they're not racing through it like we see many of the youth doing today. They're not spending time today on these very, very important aspects. Then when they move through those first two formative stages, with, remember, an abstract understanding, there is no context or discernible context in which to implement what they are learning, then they're vulnerable. They need to move to the adult phase. They need to move to that area of reflection. As you can see, they start looking back on their earlier phases. There's experience that's being developed at that particular time now, and they're moving into an actualized understanding. They're implementing and contextualizing what they were learning and reviewing some of the areas before, modifying them or becoming more grounded in them. The more mature phase, that final stage, moves to a stage of wisdom, where by life's experiences, the grounding of the deen that they've been upon, understanding the extreme to the left and the right, has enabled them to stay firm upon the Sirat al-Mustaqim. And I want to put the final frameworks which developed upon this one, so it becomes clear on what I'm saying. So Hassan, if you can put on that final slide for me, please. And I want you to look at this carefully, Khalid, and the viewers. You'll see those four stages that I mentioned in the previous slide going up vertically, okay? Founding, youthful, adult, mature phase. Then you'll see at the bottom the degree of understanding, and moving from an abstract understanding to an actualized understanding, the actualization coming with experience. And those four blue shaded circles there show that at the founding stage, it's data in actuality that they've got, which is just information. It's just information. It's not being processed in any way. They don't know what to do with it. Okay, the information, that's the second stage, as you say, data and then information, both being in convergence with each other, but without any context. It's when you are upon the element of knowledge now. It's when you start moving to the knowledgeable aspect that you can start realizing and contextualizing everything in that particular instance. This is important, Khalid, to understand this, because without understanding this context, one will not know and not be able to move beyond the liberalism that we're seeing and where it's taking many of the youth, and also the violent extremism and where that's drawing a number of the youth as well. And as you're looking, I'm going to keep that on the screen because I want you to hear the descriptions of data, information, knowledge in this instance, up to wisdom, because the description that goes with it, I think, is quite profound. So I'll mention that briefly here for you, so they can understand what this means. Data comes about through research, creation, gathering, and discovery. Information has context. Data is turned into information by organizing it so that we can easily draw conclusions. Data is also turned into information by presenting it, such as making it visual or auditory. Now, Hassan, if you can remove that slide, and I can conclude on the third and fourth stage. So knowledge now. This is when they are actualizing. This is when they've got experience of the deen in more depth. They may have family now. They may have traveled and done Umrah, Hajj, gone to other Muslim countries, seeing how Islam is actualized by the layperson, by the student of knowledge, by the scholar, to see the contexts that are actually there, which they were not able to see in the Western society, where it's the democratic processes and apparatus are in play. So knowledge now has the complexity of experience, which come about by seeing it from different perspectives. This is why training and education is difficult. One cannot count on one person's knowledge transferring to another. Knowledge is built from scratch by the learner through experience, but in the Islamic sense, from the ulama, from the students of knowledge, from who they're sitting with and learning that knowledge. Information is static, but knowledge is dynamic as it lives within us. Information being that second idealistic stage, the youthful stage that we've spoken about. Then when they reach the final stage, mature phase, wisdom, this is the ultimate level of understanding. As with knowledge, the previous stage, wisdom operates within us. We can share our experiences that create the building blocks for wisdom. However, it needs to be communicated with even more understanding of the personal context of our audience than with knowledge sharing. So let's look at these four stages now. I'm going to conclude on this part here, Khalid. Data and information, the first two vulnerable, rudimentary stages of founding and youthful stages of cognitive development. They deal with the past. They are based on gathering of facts and adding context, which they find difficult to do because of the abstract understanding. Knowledge deals with the present. That's when you move into the adult phase, that realization that maybe what I was understanding, now I've got more of a context. Now that I've got more of a grounding, was very rudimentary. The previous two stages were rudimentary and I wasn't understanding them correctly, or I'm building upon the knowledge that I had before. So knowledge deals with the present. It becomes a part of us and it enables us to perform. However, this is moving to the mature fourth stage of my cognitive development framework. When we gain wisdom, we start dealing with the future, as we are now able to vision and design for what will be rather than what is or was. And that doesn't mean now we're committing shirk and we're seeing the future, but the wisdom that we've gained from our experiences, the lessons that we've learned, the understanding, the practice of the deen, we're now able to impart it and share it, the younger generation. The younger generation being able to learn from us, be receptive to us. So I've gone on a little bit here to explain those frameworks there, but I studied that and applied that. And as far as I'm concerned, it still resonates now as it did then. And it speaks to why we see liberal extremism for those who didn't go through that process I've just described, and violent religious extremism on the other end of the spectrum, because they too didn't go through the grounding and process that I've described.
I think it's a very useful framework, and it gives you a model or something to look at people's growth, their spiritual growth, I guess you could say, and their development as a Muslim. Because being a Muslim, you grow in your Islam, especially being a revert. And I'm sure even people who are not reverts probably have a similar experience, that you're growing. And as you said, you get to a mature phase. You look at things different than the way you did prior. That doesn't mean you had to take a new minhaj, though. And that's where we see different, different people in their, and some people don't get beyond, as you pointed out, they don't get beyond certain phases, and they might leave Islam or whatever. They just got some knowledge about Islam, and then they became extremists, and then they left Islam, or they didn't become extremists, they just left Islam. Whatever the case, everyone's different. I wanted to shift things just a bit to make sure that we have some definitions about progressive and what I was intended in my research about progressives. So I tried to go to what they're saying, what the so-called progressive. So I'm going to read just a couple of little things. This is what I wrote here, because I was talking about, I don't know if you're familiar with Al-Fadl. He's an academic, Egyptian academic I think he's in the University of California system, maybe not in Berkeley, but in one of the campuses. Anyway, and he's written many books about these kind of things. And I'm just going to point out a few things from what he says. So Al-Fadl is a part of a social movement which constitutes a list of Muslim academics who refer to themselves as progressive Muslims. These Muslim academics share a common ideology based upon reform and challenging existing textual interpretations, emanating from influences from rationalism and various modernist philosophies such as feminism. One unifying trend amongst the proponents of progressivism is their disdain for Salafis or Salafism. And you will see when they write about no one else do they despise more than Salafis. And then they also probably conflate Salafis with the Takfiris as well. But they're very clear also. Even he speaks extensively about Ahl Hadith, going back to the Salaf and the people who carried Hadith and preserved the Hadith. And so amongst them, Al-Fadl Amina Wadud, a Muslim feminist who was the first woman in America to lead a mixed gender congregational prayer, and several other progressives co-authored a book of essays highlighting their ideology. And I use this extensively. So Safi, the editor of the collection, states, progressive in this usage refers to a relentless striving towards a universal notion of justice in which no single community's prosperity, righteousness, and dignity comes at the expense of another. So they totally redefine justice. They totally redefine the principles, so many Islamic principles, because they're looking outside. They take general maxims and principles of the Quran, and mostly they don't even look at the Sunnah and don't even hold it as authentic, and especially if it goes against their intellect. And so they look at these things. They'll say, well, Allah says he's al-adil, he's the most just. So justice means LGBTQT minus P, that they are, their influences are just as equally valid as Muslims. And we need to march with them, and we need to hold hands with them, and we need to sing with them and advance their cause, even though the Sharia is totally against that, does not accept that type of behavior at all, but yet they transgress the bounds and make it okay under the guise of what they redefine as justice, what they redefine as, all of these things. And as you mentioned with Nawaz and stuff like this, there's countless statements. I just want to mention, he says, Safi explains, central to this notion of progressive Muslim identity are fundamental values that we hold to be essential to a vital, fresh, and urgently needed interpretation of Islam. They want to reinterpret the text, as you mentioned, and this is what the West wants. This was what Macron wants. For the 21st century, these themes include social justice, gender justice, and pluralism. And even their statements where they talk about pluralism, intra-religious pluralism, so that means within the deen, it's okay to be all these various parties. If you want to be Takfiri, you want to be Murjia, you want to be extreme Sufi, you want to worship the grave, you want to be a Quran Muslimin political activist, just don't be Salafi. That's really what they are clearly saying. They say it, I have quotes. So anyway, I don't want to bore the people with many quotes, but subhanAllah, you see, and even regarding Tawheed, they redefined Islamic monotheism. So that's why they are considered, they make such an assault on Islam, and why it's so dangerous that they are raising their head, and that so many youth and so many people are accepting that. They just want to be, I understand everyone wants just to practice their Islam. You're an American Muslim. You just want to practice. You just want to relate to your Muslim identity. So it sounds good. Someone who has no pressures. There's no such thing as refutations anymore, unless it's against your ideology. There's no, just accept everything. I don't care, Jim or he or they or thee, whatever they call themselves in the various pronouns, that they're okay to mix with in every respect. And he just has a different, he, she, they, it has a different perspective. That's it. It's not, who am I to judge? And then they go back to the Tupac Qaeda. Only God can judge me. But that's not acceptable in Islam. That's not al-itlaq. It's not in totality. So much the same, really. So
Jazakallah, I think, again, you bringing the examples is very important here within the frameworks that I've discussed, and to show the extent of the danger of this liberalism. But there's an interesting thing, and Khalid, I want you to speak to that. And our sister Shablan, she mentioned and she described in detail what happened with Wayak's sister with Hizb ut-Tahrir at the time, and they were recruiting in colleges and universities, and the narratives that they pushed, destroying family relationships and pushing a version of Islam that was based on pure hate. Very true, my sister. And in those days, in the 90s, we were actually fighting ideologically, theologically, Hizb ut-Tahrir up and down the country. I was visiting universities, Abdul Rahim Green and others, and we were really speaking against this really insidious drive in that particular instance. Now, one thing that's interesting, Khalid, and as a student of knowledge from a religious perspective now, not the Western academia that we've got under our belts, I want you to speak to this. I remember in going back to 1993 and 94, just after I'd been elected as chairman for Brixton Mosque. And the reason I'm bringing this is because I have a book, and I remember it's called The Ethics of Disagreement, and it was produced by IIIT. And someone called Taha Alwani. Don't ask me why I remember the name and everything now, but in this book was given to me as a gift by Abdullah Al-Faisal before, as he was going into his extremism. Before he went into extremism, we knew him. Yeah. So he visited my home and he presented this book as a peace offering, because he had issues with my predecessor who'd been in for 10 months, Abu Sufyan. May Allah cure him, he's not well at the moment. And because I'd become elected as chairman, he wanted to get a foot back in the door. So he visited me at home and he brought this book to me, The Ethics of Disagreement in Islam. Why am I referring to this book? Because it's just brought back a memory that even though these two extremes are at polar opposites, there are occasionally times when they converge in agreement, if it's against who they perceive to be the common enemy, being Salafis in that instance, or there are particular ideological beliefs that both extremes hold. And I'll bring you what I mean by this. That was the Ikhwan Muslimin Brotherhood book. And they cited, speaking to what you said about everyone can come together and unite and it doesn't matter except against the Salafis, they brought the verses of the Quran in which we see that Musa alayhi salam returned from the mount with the tab, with the revelation from Allah and the Torah, and he threw it on the ground when he saw Bani Israel worshipping the calf. Okay, and they basically, and we know the story, Musa grabbed his brother Harun, and Harun said, "Oh brother, don't grab me by the hair of my head and his beard." He asked him, why did he let them do that? And Harun wasn't endorsing it. He said, "I feared that they may kill me." Okay, we know the story. They brought the narrative that, look here, this is what was mentioned in this book. The fact that Harun did not stop them from doing that showed that he wanted to have unity at all costs. Even for them to build kaf and do shirk. And this, we know, one of the principles of the Muslim Brotherhood, that whatever can bring unity, we should work towards it, and whatever causes disunity, even shirk, even this, with the worship and everything, that we should not shun that in preference for unity. So now you've got liberal extremists adhering to that. When you look at the religious violent extremists, okay, not so much Daesh, they were blowing up, and the Taliban blowing up images and everything like that. But at some stage in history, occasionally you see convergence between these two extremes to continue with or justify the various extremes that they want to propagate. And I find that interesting. And I don't know if you have any other examples, or you agree with that particular confluence that I've highlighted.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I just know that as far as their attack on orthodoxy, so they might not come together, but yet they will both have it under their sights, as under their gun, so to speak. So they'll both, throughout history, you'll find that Ahl Sunnah, Ahl Athar, the Salaf, the Ahl Hadith were attacked by various groups from Ahl Kalam and stuff like this, various groups. So they might not necessarily unite, but they did all attack them and give them names. And so this in general is what I know. And we just see in general, the danger of this, especially this progressive ideology. A lot of people, because it just feels good. No one wants to, if you're not really practicing your Islam and you want to come back to Islam, you just want everything easy. And there's nothing wrong with wanting things easy, but we have to learn our religion and know what is orthodoxy and what is not. Because just because something is easy doesn't mean it's okay. And this is a great danger. And you can see how eclectic their methodology, they have a minhaj, they have an ideology, and they have an agenda. As we see those organizations, like you mentioned, Quilliam and others, they have an agenda. They want to make kufr mainstream amongst the Muslims, so we can just, and that might not be they don't actually probably think, hey, let's make everybody disbelieve, but instead, let's get everyone to embrace our vision, our ideology. And I want to mention where the source of some of their ideology. This is a quick paragraph, quick statement. Safi, he says this in the book. He says, living in the 21st century, I urge Muslims to consider that it is no longer sufficient to study only the Quran and Hadith. Then he says, in addition to these essential founts of wisdom, they're just founts of wisdom, we need to be conversant with Rumi and Ibn Arabi, and this is the Ibn Arabi that had many Ahl Sunnah made takfir of, okay, for the statements of kufr and saying he was Allah. Come on, if that's not kufr, what Islam do you have left if you can't distinguish that between, shirk, between tawheed? Plato, he said Plato, Ibn Sina, Ghazali, and Hazrat Ali radiallahu ta'ala, Chomsky, Bob Dylan, and Bob Marley. So this gives you, I think that is such a powerful statement that gives you so much insight into what the general progressive Islam ideology is about. Even some people might not even be aware, and they might consider themselves progressives. But if they want to go, when we talk about ideology and stuff, we try to go to the sources. We try to go to the sources of those ideologies and the sources of those movements. Who are the figureheads? This is coming from academics. This is from the likes of Amina Wadud. And this is from the likes of Al-Fadl. And this is from the likes of Safi and many others that are out there, and that we see. We can get countless statements, and it has muwafaqa, it has agreeance with this. It's just it's crazy. So Bob Marley is your inspiration, for your religion of all things. What can you say? What can you say after that?
Let me get clear. So when this academic is saying that these books should be read in tandem with Quran and Hadith.
Yeah, he said, I urge Muslims to consider that it is no longer sufficient. Quran and Hadith is not sufficient. You better put some Bob Marley in there. You need to get a little Bob Dylan.
Allah musta'an. Now,
this is the reality. This is his statement. It wasn't Khalid Green. I didn't make this up. I use actual quotes for those people who might be shook, because some people, you see people all the time using, I was on this group in my local city, a Facebook group, and a guy, he came in, he said, where are the progressive, I'm new to the city, can anyone highlight to me where the progressive Muslim masjid is? That's what he actually said. I didn't comment anything, but the problem is the whole group, Aslan, really most of the people are on that anyway. That's what they want. They're bringing in feminist Muslim speakers who don't even wear hijab, and their whole thing is, a backlash against the Muslim man, and taking this eclectic ideology, and these people propagate it. people who just utter disbelief on their tongue with no shame. And the people say, what a great sister she is. Wow, I'm so glad what's her name is in Congress and the other one's in Congress, even though she says Allah is a she. People don't have the tools. They don't even look anymore at the religion and the concepts of what Allah says. That's all we're calling to. That's really what Salafiyya is. We're telling you to go back to those principles. See if what you're saying, see if your ideology, see if your perspective and your paradigm and your creed is in agreement with the Book of Allah, with the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the classical scholars, the pious predecessors. That's what we're exhorting people to. But instead, they want to reinterpret. They're saying, hey, exactly as you said, the Nawaz and others, a big part of their movement is reinterpretation. Reinterpreting. Hey, I don't like that hadith. It seems it's not in agreement with giving women their rights. I don't like this hadith because, it just doesn't make sense. How can the hellfire breathe? Why is there a hellfire? Why that's not just. That's what the Mu'tazila said. That's what others, the Jahmiyyah, some of these aspects they have co-opted and adopted from those classical deviants. And it's a travesty. It's a travesty because now it's taken so serious by, it's becoming so widespread. That's one reason why we don't usually talk about it as much, because they weren't gaining grounds. Even in my research, I found so many references of what were the academics saying. They were saying, hey, we regard in general, even Yasir Qadhi himself said, we regard Salafis to be the most effective in dealing with these guys because they can understand their arguments. They come from some of the same sources, all of these kind of things. We find the progressive than the modernists, although we prefer them in their ideology, they're more liberal, but they are not effective. They don't know their arguments and they can't be taken serious. But now the pendulum, and I was witnessing that literally while I was writing my research, finding how the pendulum was shifting. You saw it around the world, and we see it in so many Muslim countries where now more progressive and liberal forces are gaining more grounds in the society and influencing policy even and things like this. And so there's a backlash. There's a big backlash. And we could talk about that in so many different respects. And I actually did in my research.
And speaking to that, Khalid, I think one of the things that I think we can conclude on here in listening to you and bringing together our research is that what has become clear to me, and it became clear at that time, is that their guns needed to turn on Salafism, because while they were commending Salafis in our effectiveness at fighting and combating violent extremism, they knew by virtue of our position in the middle of the spectrums that I've given and the continuums that I've given, that we would put our focus and had our focus on liberalism, liberal extremism, progressive extremism as part of our counter narrative, because that is Salafiyya as it stands in the middle in that instance. So to preempt that focus, their focus and propaganda mounted and increased from the noughties when they started joining with government agencies who were ready to fund them, because the religious orthodoxy that was seen and witnessed from Salafis, and there's some other groups that are not Salafis, Deobandis and the like, they frowned upon it, right down to them speaking against Tablighi Jamaat, who are not Salafi or anything like that. But anyone espousing some form of religiosity, especially the Salafis, because of the theological depth and foundation and methodology, was a threat to them societally, which was as bad, if not worse, than the threat of terrorism, violent extremism, and the Khariji dawah in that instance. And I think if you want to add to that, and then we can draw to a conclusion, I think this has been very comprehensive, and I think it's been very important. And I dare say there has not been a discussion of this nature in the way that we're doing it on liberal and progressive extremism to date.
Mm, Yeah, we need to really it needs to go forward, and I think there will be a shift because it's becoming inevitable. It has to be because it's so so many people are leaving Islam and not knowing it, and then there's people actively leaving Islam. So I guess as a last statement, I want to mention, which highlights exactly what you said, but what I would say is it's more sinister than that. I would say that they are more willing, they would be willing, especially to accommodate Jamaat Tabligh and others. They may not agree, but they would. That's perfectly okay. And a lot of these other groups, even Ikhwan Muslimin, because a lot of them, the progressive Muslim movement is very much conscious about what they view social justice. So they will be, with the Black Lives Matter witch, because they're, it's come to light, the witchcraft of the heads of that movement, and which undermines the actual essence of fighting for equality and stuff and so forth, and the social justice that African Americans and African peoples have been denied in the Western hemisphere for so long. They undermine it with their disbelief and their kufr, but they're willing to accept that and accept everything else. But here's a statement what Safi said, and I'll end it. He says, it is imperative for progressive Muslims to resist the oppressive ideology of Wahhabism, but equally important to avoid the trap of dehumanizing the Wahhabi-oriented human beings. So they're very clear where they're focused. I'm not saying we're Wahhabi, because I don't know what that is to this date, really. We don't agree with that term. We're not blind followers or whatever of Imam Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu ta'ala. We don't follow every single issue in fiqh, but he was from the Khulafa al-Rashideen. There's no comparison, but my point is we follow the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with sunnah of Khulafa al-Rashideen and the way of the rightly guided predecessors, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, wa Ali radiyallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'in. So you can see that their focus, these progressives, especially their figureheads, is really demonizing, really attacking Salafiyah. That is their arch enemy, perhaps even more, because some of them, they know that Salafis, they can distinguish between Salafis and those Takfiri ideologues. Some of them that are studied, they know that, but they mention very much, as he said, ideology of Wahhabism. So they're very clear in what their what their agenda is and their ideology is, that this is like a tenet. It's like for those Shia Rafida, it's a tenet to curse the Sahaba and to curse Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam and say he made a mistake or deliberately deceived in giving the message to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It should have went to Ali radiyallahu ta'ala ajma'in. This is their belief. This is a tenet of their creed. Likewise, for these progressives, this is a part of their tenet. And the last thing I just want to mention is that within another week or so, I'll be actually doing a lecture about progressive Muslims with the 5-2 initiative. So I'm going to incorporate a lot of this actually right in that, because it's very, it needs to be talked about.
And make sure you share that with us, because I look forward to that. And I want to say to Sister Shama, Jazakallah khair for your feedback. Yes, it does boil down to knowing our religion and believing it with certainty. And I think that what we've seen, no sugarcoating for the presence into this world. Very, very true. Sister Shama, wayak for your dua. But what you've said, I don't think there's much to add. I think this has been very, very comprehensive. And I want the audience and the viewers to understand that this threat of liberal extremism, which is seldom spoken about in our very liberal societies, is as much, if not more, of a threat based on what you've heard in this discussion here. And as Dr. Khalid has highlighted, that the Khawarij Takfiri ideology does not espouse, and we are not endorsing it in any shape or form. It needs to continue to be fought, and our PhDs and our work over the last 20, nearly 30 years highlights that. But there's been an ignoring, there's been a dilution, an obfuscation of the liberal extremism by virtue of the fact that we're living in such a liberal society, and that you've got Muslim entities that are pushing that agenda and banging that drum for the society in order to dilute, diminish, and completely remove what we know foundationally, as well as identity-wise, of what we know of Orthodox Islam. And we'll conclude on that. And in 2 weeks, we'll be back in 2 weeks again, inshallah, and to continue the discussions around Salafiyah, the academia that speaks to it, that speaks against it, and the contemporary issues within which Salafiyah is couched now, to highlight that this indeed is the balanced perspective. Don't look at the behavior of the Salafis. Some of us have issues. Look at the perspective of Salafism and its methodology. Just like we hear individuals saying the Muslims, and we say to them when we're calling them to Islam, don't look at the behavior of the Muslims. Many of us are slipping. We're far away from that. Look at Islam. Look at Islam. So in the same way we say, don't look at, oh, the Salafis and this, because we have issues. But look at Salafiyah, Madhhab al-Salaf, with the ijma and the tenets that are there, to understand that this in actuality is Islam in its pure, pristine sense. And we will conclude on what I think has been a very engaging discussion, for me anyway, with Dr. Khalid.
Me as well,
and
myself as well.
And for the audience, brothers and sisters, your input and comments have been equally enlightening, and I hope you found this beneficial. Jazakallah khair. And the last thing I say, Khalid, one thing we have to say from this point, in order to seek and be upon guidance, we must remember the adhkar and the du'as that keep us from this. Everything we said here is academic, but above that, in every instance, to stay upon guidance, we need to know the dua and the adhkar that need to be said after Fajr, that need to be said after Maghrib, that need to be said all the time to keep us upon guidance, because we've seen individuals who have been upon this straight way. And as I've mentioned mental reasons, I've mentioned emotional reasons, I've mentioned myriad other reasons, but there's a fundamental truth that we need to look at. Allah is the one who guides. Allah is the one who changes the hearts, and he looks into the conditions of our hearts. And we really need to have that purity and that focus and the adhkar, and ask Allah to keep us upon the Sirat al-Mustaqim until we meet him. And I will end that, inshallah.
Jazakallah khairan. Allah yabarak feek, Doctor. Hayyakum Allah wa fakna wa iyyakum ila kulli ma yuhibbuhu Allah wa yardah. Ameen. And may Allah bless the audience as well. Jazakallah khairan.
Wa iyyakum, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.